É um prazer estar aqui para o arranque da série Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples, da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Durante os próximos programas, iremos ter o prazer de entrevistar grandes figuras da economia, política e sociedade. O nosso primeiro convidado é Nate Silver, estatístico norte-americano que prevê o futuro. É verdade, através de desenhar e criar modelos matemáticos, Silver tenta prever o resultado das eleições e vai estar aqui para nos explicar por que razão isto das eleições não é assim tão simples. Silver tornou-se famoso em 2008 ao acertar 49 de 50 previsões de resultado final de eleições nos estados norte-americanos nas eleições presidenciais desse ano. Entretanto, criou um blog que se chama 538, onde analisa as probabilidades de candidatos políticos vencerem as eleições e também de várias equipas vencerem títulos em várias modalidades norte-americanas também. Vai ser um prazer falar aqui com o Nate para ele explicar como funciona este negócio das previsões e porque é que isto das eleições não é assim tão simples. Nate, great to have you on the Foundation show. A pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you. I just went through some of your work background and achievements. Let's get stuck in. First question has to be, why, in your line of work, is it not so simple to get the job done?
It's a great question, and there are a couple of answers. One is that if you're trying to forecast an election, American election systems are fairly complex. We have something called the Electoral College, where each state votes essentially separately. You add those up, someone has to get 270 votes out of 538. That's where the name of my website comes from. But the issue is that the outcomes between different states are somewhat correlated, meaning someone in a state like Michigan, which is a Midwestern state, used to be pretty liberal, but was kind of very moderate. They'll vote similarly to another state like Wisconsin, for example. So when Donald Trump won Michigan in 2016, it wasn't a surprise that he won Wisconsin as well. The math behind that is kind of hard to work out. You can't treat it as 50 independent outcomes, even though each state has its own votes. And so modeling that actually takes like a lot of careful empirical data work. Also, elections don't happen very often. We have one election every 4 years. There's only about 15 elections for which we have good polling data dating back to World War II, roughly. So trying to model something based on only 15 data points when there's a lot of complexity is quite challenging.
In a nutshell, tell us how and why you decided to start creating these models and trying to predict the future, which is basically what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably because there's always been a lot of fascination around this question of trying to understand who's going to win the next election. I mean, even now in the U.S., this may be a very American thing. Even now, it just became 2022. People are talking about 2024. Will Trump run again, for example? Will Biden be the nominee? So there's always a market for it, but trying to apply a way that's a little bit more data-driven and scientific, trying to move beyond conventional wisdom and actually scrutinize hypotheses and analyze data and be more rigorous is kind of the idea here. It was born out of my frustration in part with watching media coverage of previous campaigns, which is often kind of frivolous and not very rigorous.
Now, you took America by storm back in 2009 when you correctly predicted the winners of 49 out of the 50 states in the presidential elections. You then predicted the outcome of the 35 Senate seats going up for election as well. That same model actually allowed you to give Donald Trump a larger possibility of victory in the elections against Hillary Clinton as well. How did you do it? How did you come up with these models and come up with these correct predictions?
So what you're basically doing is trying to see how accurate polls have been in the past. If you conduct a poll, it has a margin of error, which means that given that you only interviewed 600 people, it's not the same as interviewing all of the United States or all of a particular state. And that part's quantifiable, but there are also other reasons why polls can be inaccurate. It may be easier to reach some groups than others. So what we try to do is figure out empirically how accurate are polls really. And the answer is that the errors are larger than you'd guess based on what the polls claim. But still, you can put probability distributions on it and translate a polling lead to a probability. So if a candidate is ahead by 3 points with a week to go, how often will they win? In a year like 2008 or 2012, where the polls picked the right winner in a lot of states, then in some ways, what my model does is very simple, right? It just kind of says, okay, on average, the polls will be correct. And so you look smart if the polls are good. I think there's more value in years in some ways where the polls are wrong and you're trying to quantify how wrong can they be without overturning the result. So in 2016, for example, Clinton actually had only a fairly small polling lead in the key states. She was ahead, but that's why Trump had a 25 or a 30% chance of winning, because they didn't have to be off by very much within range of how often they've been off in the past for Trump to win. So that's where I think actually add more value is in that probability part. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's easier when every state the polls are just right. But polls are kind of a valuable but somewhat blunt instrument, and we try to quantify that.
I love the saying, numbers don't lie, because they don't, but also because in your case, you need to pick the right numbers in order to come out with the right results. How do you do that? How do you filter the information?
I mean, in theory, it's all empirical, where you're saying, hey, what has worked in the past to predict elections? But of course, it's a little bit more complex than that. In reality, you want to look for things that are more robust. Polls have been fairly robust over time, meaning that even as conditions change in the U.S., the polls do a decent job, although not great. We can talk about some issues with the polling later. Mm-hmm. There are other robust trends that, for example, when the economy is better, that tends to be good for the incumbent party. So in a year when you have inflation going up, for example, as it is in the U.S., probably bad news for Joe Biden and Democrats. People get mad at the Democrats for higher inflation. There are trends like at the midterm elections, which we're having later this year in the U.S., the president's party tends to lose seats the very large majority of the time. So, look, it's like any empirical science where there is some degree of judgment involved. When you have only 15 data points, like I said, then you have to kind of apply some theoretical priors about, like, here's something which happened by coincidence versus here's something which I think really is more important and central to the system. So there is some judgment calls required versus other fields where you might have hundreds or thousands of data points. But still, that's what we're trying to do, is trying to tease out what has worked in the past to predict elections that we think will continue to predict well going forward.
I think it'd be fair to say that there is kind of a war going on in the media landscape between facts, numbers, and opinion/propaganda. And it's been a trend over the last few years, especially with the rise of social media. You address that in your book, The Signal and the Noise. What do you hope to achieve in the work that you do, and how do you make sure that people pay attention to facts rather than to opinion and propaganda? Because it's increasingly difficult to tell the difference between the two, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, certainly in the United States, we have a lot of partisanship and polarization. I wouldn't say that both parties are equally responsible for that, but at the same time, something like COVID, where you see people kind of always claim, well, the science is on my side, but they'll say that no matter which side they're on, right? Some side will say, well, closing schools is really bad. Here's all the data on that. Another side will say, well, we need to stop the spread or else we'll have further problems with Omicron, whatever else. Here's the data on that. So I want to teach people to be more rigorous and critical in their thinking, to be less partisan potentially. That doesn't mean we're saying both sides are equally right, but it means that you have to kind of overcome your own, because everybody who's covering politics has a bias, including me, certainly, right? We have our own point of view that is informed by our backgrounds, informed by maybe our party identity. So overcoming that is difficult, and that's the work I want people to do, right? It's not as simple as just saying, okay, here's where the data is. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes there is a simple thing that people ignore. But to tease out what is the actual truth here is challenging.
I wanted to touch on your blog 538, because more than Nate Silver, you now have this platform that addresses a lot of the big topics in the agenda, goes out into other areas as well, such as sport. But what do you want to accomplish with the creation of this, initially a blog, which is of course much more than that? Now it's a platform.
Yeah, no, it's kind of the same as the answer before, where we want to apply more rigor to covering elections and politics and other things like sports, which are more fun, of course. That doesn't just mean making election predictions, though. So in the U.S. right now, there are various threats to democracy, from the events of January 6th to attempts to make it potentially harder to vote, to gerrymandering. And so covering that is also important, even if there aren't predictive implications per se. And there are lots of issues. The Supreme Court is making important rulings every year, for example. So we just want to, not everything has to be a prediction. I love predictions. It's kind of my background, but we have a couple dozen people working for 538 that have lots of different expertise in lots of different areas, right? And the term we sometimes use is data journalism. So you can have people who are actually, doing traditional journalism in a way, calling experts or interviewing people, but supplementing it with statistical analysis and graphic design and everything else to make it more rigorous.
You mentioned polling already, and I wanted to get into it a little bit because traditionally, historically, polling has carried a lot of weight. However, do you think that's still the case today? And what are the main limitations or challenges around it, especially after the presidential elections, which saw Trump overcome Hillary, even though a lot of the polling had Hillary out in front in a lot of the states?
Yeah, both in 2016 and 2020, you had somewhat below average accuracy for polling. It was not as below average as people may have assumed, because polling has had other years in the past where it was pretty far off. But there's no doubt that polling's reputation took a hit after those years. What's funny is it doesn't seem to stop people from still looking at polls a lot, right? A lot of times I kind of follow the arguments on social media and so forth. There's a new poll that comes out about 2022 or 2024. People still argue about that. So people always say, oh, we're sick and tired of polling, and kind of don't really seem to be willing to dispense with it. But, look, it's important to kind of get the pulse on what actual Americans think, right? Again, we kind of go back to COVID's the kind of leading agenda item of the day in the U.S. or inflation, right? People make all types of claims about, oh, people do or don't care about inflation or this or that or school closings, whatever else, right? Ideally, you'd want to kind of actually know what the public thinks. Doesn't mean you have to follow public opinion on every issue, but in a democracy, that's an important function, is to have feedback between the people and their representatives. And so that's why polling actually serves, I think, an important function in a democratic society, and why, if polling is getting tougher, which we can talk about whether it is or not, then that means we're a less well-informed electorate in some sense, and that would be bad for society, other things being equal.
Obviously, one of the difficulties is the guaranteeing a solid response rate in polls. The fact that the current landscape, at least in the States and many countries also here in Europe, where society is becoming increasingly polarized as well, and maybe people kind of just disconnect from the system because they don't believe in it. They just believe in whatever rhetoric they're following. Does that affect the polling as well?
Potentially. So the issue you're getting at is what we call non-response bias, which is that, are some people more likely to respond to polls than others? And are there ways to correct for that or not, right? The answer in the U.S. at least is there very likely is some non-response bias, where people who have less trust in institutions may not be as inclined to return a call if a pollster calls and says, I am calling from so-and-so polling organization or university or news network. People who don't trust the mainstream media, which means Republicans in the U.S. may not respond to polls as much. There are ways to try to correct for this, but they have proven incomplete, I guess I'd say, in the American context, and that's tended to lead polls to underestimate the amount of anti-establishment kind of pro-Trump sentiment in the U.S. Not that dramatically, but enough that the polls were miscalibrated for the past couple of election cycles. It seems not to occur as much when Trump himself is not on the ballot. So maybe that Trump makes people excited who ordinarily wouldn't participate in elections, who ordinarily would stay home, that people will actually vote for Trump, but maybe not respond to a poll necessarily.
Later this year, in November, there'll be midterm elections, and you've alluded to that. Knowing what we know from history, from the past, and looking at the models and the data that you call upon in the work that you develop, what can we predict can happen in those midterm elections?
So the first and most important observation is that historically the president's party, meaning Joe Biden's Democrats, lose ground. So that's the baseline expectation, and the polling so far is consistent with that. For example, there's a gubernatorial election in Virginia, which is now a fairly blue, meaning Democratic state, that elected a Republican governor in November of this year. It's all consistent with what we'd expect historically. There are a few complications, one being that in the Senate, only 1/3 of senators are up for re-election every year, and they happen to be senators that are mostly Republicans this year. So that means Democrats might have more of a fighting chance to keep the Senate than they ordinarily would.
Okay.
In the House, once every 10 years, new district lines are drawn. That was this year, actually. These states are finalizing their redistricting process now, it's called. That may actually help Democrats a little bit. Their map is a little bit better, believe it or not, than it was in 2020. But still, Democrats have a very narrow majority in the House, and so even modest losses would be enough for them to lose control of the House. So it's not a certainty. If you're doing our model, we're going to wait a few months before we do this, but it probably won't be 90-10, right? But the GOP will likely be pretty solid favorites based on historical trends and the way that the polling so far is matching those trends.
Okay. It'll be interesting to see what transpires leading up to those midterm elections then. I really wanted to find out, how much pressure do you feel to get things right? And what are the main challenges for you to remain credible in the results that you produce?
I think, if we're being honest, part of the challenge is that the way that I would judge myself maybe is different than how the public would judge my forecast, right? For me, for example, if we say that a given set of outcomes are supposed to happen 70% of the time, 70, we actually want that to be wrong 30% of the time, right? Because 70% is not 100%. We want to be what's called well calibrated. Most people would rather just that you be right all the time. They don't care about the probabilities as much, right? For me, again, like in 2016, when we have a roughly 30% chance of Trump winning, and the conventional wisdom or the markets, you actually can bet on this stuff in the US, and the market said, 15%, 1.5, to us, that was like a good result, because it meant that we were we were confident in Trump relative to the markets. And so if you were betting on the outcomes, you would have made money. But I don't think the average person thinks like that. They just want me to be right all the time. And so, so I don't know if you call it pressure, because it's kind of out of my control, right? I can build the best models that I can and try to be as honest as I can about what the probabilities actually are. But you're always, to me, there's a bit of luck involved as far as, do you happen to get your close calls right or not? So I wouldn't say it's pressure, because I just do the best I can no matter what. And you're going to look smart sometimes and not so smart other times.
It's such a tricky landscape, I think, Nate. Once again, going back to social media, digital media, everybody seems to have an opinion, and everybody's opinion matters. And the kind of experience or expertise is not paid as much attention as it should. What's the biggest threat for you? Is it trolling? Is it so-called influencers that can come up with their own reasoning based on I don't know what?
I mean, there are different ways to describe what the different threats are. I mean, I go back to the very first question you asked about, why is what you're doing harder than it seems, right? I think people don't necessarily realize that. There's a lot of kind of very amateurish polling analysis, and I'm trying to provide a counterweight to that. At the same time, look, a lot of commentary in the U.S. is very partisan. So, so when you have a forecast showing Democrats are going to do well, the Democrats really like you. When you don't, they don't. And so trying to kind of overcome that is a little bit difficult. To deal with the perceptions, which are partly true and partly false, about the decline of accuracy of polling can be difficult. But you kind of can become, I don't know, whenever you have expertise in a certain area, then you become you become a threat to people in certain ways, I guess, and a target in certain ways. And again, I look at people under COVID and different epidemiologists or whatnot, and believe me, I've been critical too of some policy choices that have been made in the U.S. But you realize to be kind of like thrust in the public spotlight in a field where you do have a lot of specific knowledge, and which is actually more difficult than you might think, and you're trying to explain complex probabilistic factors to people in the public eye. I mean, it's not easy. You have to calibrate a lot of different things, and it's a challenge.
Now, I wanted to get your take on this because a few years ago, the foundation organized an event with Philip Tetlock, who's a psychologist who's devoted himself and his career to studying the quality of the forecasts of experts, writing in newspapers, commenting on television. As a forecaster, but also as a commentator, how do you assess the quality of pundits overall?
So there's kind of an empirical answer to this, which is that you do it based on what's called calibration, which means that if you ask people to make a probabilistic forecast, then are they right about the probabilities the right amount of the time? So that example I gave before, where out of all your 70% forecast, they should be right about 70% of the time. And Tetlock did this over many years, over many different subfields of political science and economics. One thing he found is that actually people who are generalists, meaning people who have a lot of different areas of knowledge and interests, are better forecasters than people who are very domain specific, right? So he calls them foxes instead of hedgehogs. We can get into what that means or not. But people who are kind of consuming lots of different information, who are not becoming overly ideological, who take different hypotheses, who read widely, who talk to experts in different fields, tend to do better. And so that's an important truth, right? When we face big, complex societal questions, then it should be people from different areas coming together and having discussions and debates, and not just kind of one expert in one field. And that's an important finding of his that gets overlooked sometimes.
I actually was wondering the kind of impact that COVID has had in the line of work that you do. Do you find that you've had more attention around the 538 blog because people are at home more often? Have you had more time as well to develop more models and focus more attention on predictions?
I mean, I'm one of those people who, if I work from home, I feel like I'm less productive. Most people are more productive, but I think my mind tends to wander a bit more. One direct impact of COVID is that in 2020, because Democrats were more likely in the U.S. to stay home and abide by social distancing recommendations, they were at home more. So like literally they had more time to like answer phone calls from pollsters. That may have been why you saw a Democratic bias in the polls in 2020. It's also kind of shaking up different coalitions in the U.S. that among Democrats, there are pretty big debates about school reopenings, for example. So you may see kind of different political coalitions emerging. I mean, I'm 44 years old, just turned 44. COVID has to be among the 2 or 3 most important political developments of my lifetime. Almost 1 million people have died in the United States. So it may have like long-lasting effects on political coalitions and how people think about how they're living their lives. And so as someone who kind of studies human behavior, that's what polling is. We're trying to study human behavior. It's hard not to be a little bit fascinated by the way different societies have tried to adapt to COVID and how challenging it's been, almost no matter kind of what path you pursue. There's almost no country that says, okay, we've gotten everything right. Everybody has some regrets. In the U.S., we probably have more than most countries, to be honest. We've had pretty high death rates. Society's been very disrupted, but like it's a fascinating subject to study for sure.
Yeah, I won't get into the role that some recommendations may or may not have been made by a particular head of state during that initial part of the pandemic. Anyway, what I did want to close out our conversation with was asking you what project you're working on now. What can we expect in the future? Is there any innovation that you're working on? What can you tell us about that?
So I'm working on a book now that's about gambling and risk. So basically, I'm talking to people who take risks for a living, whether they're like poker players or artists or mountain climbers or whatever else, and trying to understand how they think, and maybe how it's different than how the ordinary person might think. And so in some ways, my first book, The Signal and the Noise, was more of a technical exploration of these topics. This is a way to kind of get at the personalities a little bit more, because when you're kind of making bets for a living, then you probably have lots of things that separate you from the way the average person thinks. You might be a little bit more contrarian, is a term that sometimes gets used. You might be a little bit more nonconformist in some ways. It's trying to find commonalities between this kind of broad set of people that are maybe not taking their life in their own hands, although sometimes they are, but at least kind of using probability in a way that actually will have big impacts on their financial well-being and their life well-being.
All right, well, good luck with that. We're going to finish with 4 quick-fire questions. So in a sentence or so, I'd like you to try to answer these to the best of your ability. So what is a personality trait that, in your opinion, a good leader should have?
A good leader should have? I'm a big guy on honesty. I think we've seen again in COVID how attempts to skirt the truth have almost always wound up backfiring. And so assume people are smart enough to deal with the truth.
In your opinion, what's the biggest challenge that humanity is facing now, whether that's in your line of work or generally?
I think climate change is a pretty obvious answer. It's a worldwide problem. In the U.S., threats to democracy are also a really big problem that may not be as worldwide, although the rise of authoritarianism worldwide is also a threat. But I'm a believer in climate change as being humanity's number one long-term goal, at least, to solve.
No doubt about that, and most of the experts we've interviewed have said the same. If you could change one thing in the world today by magic, what would that be?
I mean, it's probably not the most important thing. It almost definitely isn't, but like having people think more probabilistically is kind of my thing. So it's not number one. You probably want people to be kinder and more empathetic or whatever else. But I think probabilistic thinking is an important quality as well.
And what is the most important learning of your life so far?
Ooh, maybe it's what my new book is about in some ways. But I think the most important learning is that like people are not as good as they could be at thinking for themselves, right? It sounds like a cliche, but people are social beings. They tend to like kind of follow their peers. That's very understandable. I am in most ways as well. But not losing sight of like authority is meant to be kind of questioned and challenged without turning into to a crazy person, right? Finding that balance is pretty difficult, I think.
Nate, thanks for your honesty. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. Definitely one of the peers when it comes to the area of work that you're involved in. So I follow you closely, not only because of the political work you do, but the sports work you do as well. So all the best, and hope to continue to follow your predictions on 538.
Of course, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Foi a conversa com Nate Silver, estatístico norte-americano, que nos explicou porque isto das eleições não é assim tão simples. Até breve.